In this module, we'll deal with communicating with an HTTP server in order to finally carry out a real login. We'll execute queries to the server passing the entered data and waiting for the feedback regarding the login validity with the data of the currently logged in user. For this purpose, we have to learn about the method of calling HTTP queries in the Android environment. The basic class used to execute queries in case of Android is the HTTP URL connection class. It's a basic method of communication that has been recommended since version 2.3. Before this version, the basic method of HTTP communication was Apache HTTP client. However, because it's an external library, it stopped being supported by Google since version 2.3. HTTP URL connection makes it possible to execute various GET and PUT type queries, pass data, or set headers. However, it is an API, which is very difficult and pretty tedious to use. It requires using and operating on Java streams. This means that it involves a lot of code, which is too much hassle. There are libraries which make it possible to facilitate this process, but we won't deal with them because they are beyond the scope of this course. We will focus on HTTP URL connection and how to use it. In order to know which query we want to execute, we'll look into the parse documentation, which nicely shows the way to carry out a login, as well as downloading and sending data. Let's start with the login itself, that is, the sign-in option. Having opened the documentation of the REST protocol, we may go to the Users tab where we have, for instance, the logging in option, that is, logging into an existing account, and signing up, that is, creating such an account. In our web application, we already have accounts we can use, but we could just as well create them. For instance, we have an account named Test with the password Test, which we can log into. So let's log in now without signing up. An interesting thing in terms of the parse documentation is the fact that each example is illustrated with a code fragment that can be copied to the console and executed. In our case, we can immediately choose the application we're interested in. We get the ready headers, which we have to adjust to our application. We can copy the code fragment we're interested in to our console and call it. At this moment, the HTTP query is executed, from which we get a response, which is a JSON. In our case, we got the error invalid login parameters, code 101. It results from the fact that the documentation includes sample data. We can substitute it with the login data we've used. After introducing the relevant login data, as a response, we get a bit more data. It's actually the complete data of a logged-in user. It includes, for instance, the information about when the user was created, when the account was last updated, what the user name is, what the user ID is, as well as another item which is particularly useful to us, session token. It's the key we'll use in case of subsequent queries to introduce ourselves as a particular logged-in user. Crucially, this is something that must be stored all the time we're logged in. Additionally, we've received an ACL, that is, Access Control List, which is a special construction that allows us to define who may have access to a particular line. In our case, we have the user object, and only the current user may read and write data. Now, let's try to execute the entire operation in the code. As I've mentioned, we'll need a lot of code to build the query and execute it. That's why we'll use the existing code in the attachment. We'll open the file with the HTTP utils class and copy its contents. In the case of Android Studio, there is a very useful option of pressing Ctrl-V on a particular package. If what we have in the clipboard is a class, the relevant file for the class will be created and placed in a specific package. This way, we get a ready compiling code, which is saved in the HTTP utils file. Now we'll see how the login is implemented. Here, we have the getLogin method, with two parameters, the username and the password. This method may throw an exception. IOException is a typical exception that comes up when, for instance, we don't have a connection or the connection is lost. Executing the getInLogin method consists of two parts. First, we build the URL which we want to use. We do it by calling the getLoginURL method, where we pass the username and the password. It results from the fact that the data regarding the user in our code was passed as data URL encode, which means that it was attached at the end of the URL address. Below, we see how the URL is built in the getLoginURL method. The extracted values are added in an appropriate form to the base URL, which we can use to execute a login in parse. We can use the return string for the HTTP query. Our URL is passed to the callHTTP method, which, apart from the address, receives a method. In this case, it's get. There are two additional parameters which are not used: a token, which we use the moment we log in, and a body, which is used whenever you want to send data to the server. We use get, so we have no body. And given that we aren't logged in, we won't pass the token.